right, party peoples of the interwebs, if I'm doing a car vlog and it's not in my car because the sun has set and I don't have the lighting, it's for a very good reason. There is some breaking news in the Roger Ver Bitcoin Jesus indictment extradition from Spain to America, where he faces up to 109 years in jail for alleged tax evasion and mail fraud. The spoiler is his appeal was dismissed, so he is susceptible of being extradited at any point in time. We'll get there in a second. To begin, and it relates to pardons and Donald Trump's pardon of the Jan 6 political prisoners. The news is that there are about a half dozen political prisoners who have yet to be released from the gulags in which they are being kept, some of which are in DC, others are in California, one of which I think is in Kentucky. We'll get there, but there are at least a half dozen who have not been released despite the pardon. The reason for which they haven't been released, I needed to make sure I understood. And tomorrow, as at the time of shooting this vlog, I'm going to have on Suzanne Monk, who is vigorously representing the interests of these people who should be out and are not out because the full tenor of the pardon is not being given to the pardon and others are just being done dirty. We'll get there. One of them is Jeremy Brown. Now, I talked about Jeremy Brown a number of times. Jeremy Brown is currently sitting in federal detention as a result of the gun charges for which he pleaded or was found guilty, which were incidental to the January 6th investigation. And so he was found guilty or pleaded guilty to gun charges unrelated to January 6th, but which were only discovered in the context of the raids from January 6th. So he's one of the cases, the exceptional cases where there's a man still being held in jail, but because of felony charges that were not directly related to January 6th, and therefore, as the steel man of the argument would go, were not pardoned by the January 6th pardons. Jeremy Brown's case is very unique. I had CanCon Brian Lupa on a week ago to talk about it because it's an injustice however you cut it, but he's still sitting in jail because the charges were not directly related to the January 6th pardon insofar as whether or not you give the full scope and application of the pardon as it was intended to be issued to cover everything and anything related to the January 6th abuse. Because it's not just that they got some fruits from that poison tree that were not related to January 6th that you can keep those men locked up. Jeremy Brown is one case. The one that's come to my attention now, and I've been in touch with a lot of people about it to make sure I understood this, is a guy named Dominic Box. Now, Dominic Box is still being held in federal detention, despite the fact that he is only apparently guilty or charged with DUI at the state level. I've been getting asked, pleaded with, to raise awareness for this because it simply does not make sense. Dominic Box still being detained in federal detention, despite the pardon. His charges were related to January 6th and should be covered by the pardon. He's still in detention because he was apparently passed out or found passed out in his vehicle in the context of the prosecution. Let me just pull this up here so that we can actually understand what I'm talking about. Right here, Tampa Bay Times, other J6ers with similarly unclean pardon situations include Homososa's Daniel Ball, who was released and quickly rearrested on a warrant for gun possession, a charge that emerged from the search related to January 6th, and Dominic Box himself, who was awaiting sentencing for felony civil disorder, remains in the same Kentucky jail as Brown. While awaiting trial for his January 6th charges, Box was arrested by a deputy who said he found him passed out in his car outside a Jacksonville restaurant. Now, why that is so particularly egregious is that Lord knows what was going on, why he was passed out in his car. Some might say the process is the punishment and drives people to alcoholism or whatever. Passing no judgment on that because there's been no judgment on that. How are they holding him in federal detention when it's a state DUI charge? Now, people are saying, Viva, he needs to get out, and I wanted to make sure I understood the situation before getting vocal and public about it. He needs to be gotten out. And tomorrow, Suzanne Monk is going to come on and talk about these cases. There's no good reason to be keeping Dominic Ball in federal detention. He should be released, remanded into state custody where he can post bail or get bonded out on his DUI charge. No excuse. There's no flaw, fault, or shade being thrown at Donald Trump. He's had a 3 weeks of fire hosing of making America great again. I have no doubt that he is not entirely aware of the fact that his pardon, as issued, is not being given the deference and respect that it is owed. And I have no doubt that he's not fully aware of the fact that there are a half dozen people who are currently being detained, some for no good reason whatsoever, and others merely by virtue of the fact that the charges for which they were found guilty or pleaded were not directly related to January 6th. Bottom line, Dominic Box needs to be out yesterday. And so whether it's Governor DeSantis or Senator Rick Scott or Donald Trump himself, if anyone raises awareness of this and brings it to their attention, I have no doubt that they are unaware of the fact that their pardon is not receiving its intended application. Now, Speaking of pardons and speaking of injustices, I have had Roger Ver on the channel earlier this week. I've been covering the Roger Ver story with my partner in Sunday Night, Viva and Barnes Law for the People. We've talked about this case at length. A man who is being indicted and requested for extradition because of alleged unpaid taxes for an exit tax that he didn't allegedly pay when he left the country.
America has golden handcuffs. The only way, if the IRS is after you, if the IRS is your enemy, if the IRS is engaged in lawfare against you, the only way that you can get out from under it is not leaving the country. It's renouncing your citizenship. That is the only way you can get out from under the thumb of the IRS. And so for Roger, given that there was IRS lawfare against him and his family, dating back all the way to that ill-fated debate where he called out the IRS as well, the only way you can possibly get out from under that, unfortunately, is to give up your U.S. citizenship. And so for him, it was a really hard decision for you to make.
So not only was I the very first person in the world to start investing in the Bitcoin ecosystem, I was one of the very first people in the entire world to try and pay taxes on their Bitcoin assets as well. And so at the time I renounced, you're supposed to pay taxes on your net worth, a global net worth. And so remember, in 2014, Mt. Gox had just collapsed. The worldwide global trade volume for Bitcoin was less than $10 million a day. So it wasn't anything even remotely like what it is today. I had the CPAs and tax accountants that checked everything. And then I literally hired former federal prosecutors to take a look at all the different other people in the chain. So I had actually 4 separate layers of people like going and double checking everything to make sure that everything was correct. And at the end of the day, everybody thought that everything was correct and did everything to the best of their ability. And even looking back on it in hindsight, I think we did a really, really good job. And the IRS is just plain lying and going after me with political lawfare that hopefully can come to an end very, very soon. That's actually one of the arguments that we have against them too. It's something called forum shopping. The U.S. is not allowed to do what's called forum shopping. The U.S. knew when I was in Japan. They knew when I was in Korea. I was in Singapore. I was in Dubai, all within a month or two of me arriving in Spain. Why didn't they have me arrested in any of those countries? And the reason is they didn't think any of those countries would be likely to extradite me. Whereas the U.S. and Spain are such close allies, the U.S. thought they had a much better chance of having me extradited from Spain, which is why they had me arrested in Spain. And it's why they had John McAfee arrested in Spain as well. He was zipping around the world as well. Why didn't they have him arrested in any of the other countries? It's because the U.S. feels the most confident that they'll have people extradited from Spain. But I'm hoping and optimistic that the Spanish authorities will see that this is just lawfare that's being used against me. And I hope they'll see it for that and do the right thing here in Spain as well.
The details of this case involve violation of solicitor-client privilege, alleged unpaid taxes for what is regarded as the deemed disposition of assets when you leave the country because Roger Ver fled America because of the lawfare persecution that was inflicted upon him in the early 2000s when he had the audacity of criticizing the ATF for having murdered the children at Waco. The ATF didn't like that. They decided to go and get him on firecracker charges, literally firecracker charges. He was reselling pest control firecrackers on the internet that he procured from Cabela's. They locked him up for 10 months after he pleaded because they were looking for years. And then after he got out, he said, I don't trust the government not to come after me again. He left the country and they still went after him again. They claim that he concealed from them the transfer or sale or deemed disposition of Bitcoin and that he should now go to jail for 109 years because of that. It was a persecution from the prior administration and he had appealed the extradition request in Spain and his appeal has now been dismissed, which means he is free to be extradited back to America. He was being held in the same Spanish prison in which John McAfee perhaps Epsteined himself or perhaps didn't, and they want to bring him back and lock him up for the rest of his life. He has appealed for a pardon, or at the very least for Pam Bondi, who is now the Attorney General, to drop the charges. Bottom line, even if she dropped the charges, he would need a pardon so that he wouldn't face exposure, so that he could come back to his homeland of America, even though he's not a citizen anymore, which makes this persecution even more egregious, that they're trying to indict a non-citizen for alleged unpaid taxes to a country in which he doesn't live. Let that sink in. But his appeal has been dismissed, and he is now basically at the whim of extradition to America. So this is about raising awareness to Pam Bondi to get involved in all of these cases, to right the wrongs of prior administrations, and to ensure that Donald Trump's intended pardon receives its application in full, in letter, and in spirit. So those are the updates. Stay tuned tomorrow, 12:30. I'm going to have on Suzanne Monk. We're going to go over the other J6ers who have not yet been released. But those are the latest breaking details. Make sure that the pardons for the Jan 6ers receive their full application and pardon Roger Ver, because once you authorize or ratify or tolerate the injustices that have been waged upon Roger Ver, literally no one on earth is safe. And I hope Elon Musk understands this as well. If you do not oppose a foreign country extraditing someone who is no longer a citizen on the basis of unpaid taxes, literally no one is safe anywhere throughout the world. Viva Fry, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, make sure your notifications are turned on, and I will see you on the flip side of the internet, dude meisters. Booyah!
This is dangerous at every level to American liberty. And Elon Musk should smack himself in the face both ways 5 different times for even suggesting that if you are no longer a citizen, that this abuse is okay as long as you do it to somebody who gave up their citizenship.